Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Little Red Riding Hood. She lived in a small village with her mother. One day, her mother asked her to visit her grandmother, who lived deep in the forest. "Take this basket of food to Grandma. Be careful and stay on the path," said her mother. Little Red Riding Hood put on her red cape and started her journey. She was excited but remembered her mother's warning to stay safe and not talk to strangers. As Little Red Riding Hood walked through the forest, she admired the trees and flowers. The sun was shining, and the birds were singing. Suddenly, she saw a wolf standing by the path. "Where are you going, little girl?" the wolf asked in a friendly voice. Little Red Riding Hood stopped for a moment. She remembered her mother's advice but thought the wolf seemed kind. "I'm going to visit my grandmother," she said. "She lives just past the river." The wolf smiled and asked, "Is your grandmother sick? What are you taking her?" Little Red Riding Hood didn't think the wolf was dangerous. "Yes, she is not feeling well, and I'm taking her some bread and fruit," she replied. The wolf's eyes sparkled with an idea. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. "I hope your grandmother feels better soon," the wolf said, pretending to care. Then, he disappeared into the trees without another word. Little Red Riding Hood continued her walk through the forest. She picked a few flowers along the way, thinking her grandmother would love them. Meanwhile, the wolf ran quickly to the grandmother's house. He knocked on the door. "Who is it?" asked the grandmother from inside. "It's me, Little Red Riding Hood," said the wolf, trying to sound like the little girl. The grandmother, who was in bed, said, "Come in, dear." The wolf entered the house with a big, sneaky grin. The grandmother couldn't see very well without her glasses, so she didn't realize it was the wolf. As soon as he stepped inside, the wolf jumped toward the bed and swallowed the grandmother in one big gulp. He looked around and noticed the grandmother's clothes. "These will fit me perfectly," he thought. The wolf quickly dressed in her clothes, put on her glasses, and climbed into bed. He pulled the blanket up to his chin and waited for Little Red Riding Hood to arrive. Little Red Riding Hood finally reached her grandmother's house. She knocked on the door, excited to see her. "Come in, my dear," said a strange voice. Little Red Riding Hood opened the door and stepped inside. She walked over to the bed where her grandmother was lying. But something seemed different. "Grandmother, what big ears you have," she said, surprised. "All the better to hear you with, my dear," replied the wolf, trying to sound like the grandmother. Little Red Riding Hood looked closer and noticed more strange things. "Grandmother, what big eyes you have," she said, stepping a little closer to the bed. "All the better to see you with, my dear," the wolf said. Little Red Riding Hood started to feel worried. She had never seen her grandmother look like this before. "Grandmother, what big teeth you have," she exclaimed. The wolf couldn't hide his excitement any longer. "All the better to eat you with," he shouted, jumping out of bed. The wolf lunged at Little Red Riding Hood, ready to swallow her too. But Little Red Riding Hood was quick. She screamed and ran toward the door, trying to escape. At that moment, a hunter who was walking nearby heard her scream. He rushed into the house and saw the wolf chasing Little Red Riding Hood. Without thinking, the hunter grabbed his axe and shouted, "Stop right there, wolf!" The wolf froze in fear, surprised by the sudden interruption. The brave hunter took a step closer to the wolf, holding his axe tightly. "Let the girl go," he said. The wolf realized he was trapped and had no chance to escape. He started to shake with fear. The hunter moved quickly and knocked the wolf to the ground. Little Red Riding Hood ran to the corner of the room, watching the scene in shock. The hunter tied the wolf up with a rope, making sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. "You're safe now," the hunter told her. Little Red Riding Hood thanked the hunter for saving her life. She was still a little scared but felt safe knowing the wolf couldn't harm her anymore. "But what about my grandmother?" she asked, looking worried. The hunter walked over to the wolf and carefully opened its mouth. To everyone's surprise, the grandmother was still alive. She jumped out of the wolf's mouth, a little shaken but unharmed. Thank you," she cried, hugging both Little Red Riding Hood and the hunter. Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother were overjoyed to be together again. The hunter stayed for a while, making sure they were both all right. "You were very brave, Little Red Riding Hood," he said with a kind smile. The little girl blushed. "I just didn't know the wolf would try to trick me," she replied. "Next time, I'll be more careful." The hunter nodded and said, "That's a good idea. Remember, it's always better to stay cautious in the forest." After the wolf was taken away, Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother sat down to enjoy the food that the girl had brought. "Thank you for the bread and fruit, dear," said the grandmother. "I feel much better now, especially after all the excitement." They laughed together, glad that the wolf was gone. Little Red Riding Hood thought about the day's adventure. She realized how important it was to listen to her mother's advice and always stay alert. On her way home, Little Red Riding Hood thought about everything that had happened. She felt proud of herself for being brave, but she also understood how dangerous it had been to talk to the wolf. "I won't make that mistake again," she promised herself. The forest was quiet now, and the sun was beginning to set. Little Red Riding Hood hurried along the path, eager to get back home to tell her mother about her adventure. When Little Red Riding Hood arrived home, her mother was waiting at the door. "How was your visit to Grandma?" her mother asked. Little Red Riding Hood ran into her mother's arms. "It was very exciting, but I learned an important lesson," she said. She told her mother all about the wolf, the hunter, and how they saved Grandma. Her mother listened carefully and said, "I'm so glad you're safe, but remember, always stay on the path and never talk to strangers again." From that day on, Little Red Riding Hood always followed her mother's advice. She didn't stray from the path, and she didn't talk to strangers, no matter how kind they seemed. The wolf was never seen again in the forest, and Little Red Riding Hood's adventures became famous in the village. Everyone admired her bravery and the way she learned from her mistakes. Her story was told to children as a reminder to always be careful and listen to their parents. Little Red Riding Hood visited her grandmother often after that day. Each time, she made sure to stay on the safe path, and she always arrived without any trouble. Her grandmother, feeling much better, loved to hear about the things happening in the village. "You're growing up so fast, my dear," Grandma would say. "I'm proud of you for being so brave." Little Red Riding Hood smiled, happy to have such a loving grandmother who was always there for her. The forest became a safer place, and the villagers no longer feared walking through it. The hunter kept watch, making sure no wolves or other dangerous animals came near. Little Red Riding Hood became friends with the hunter, and they often met in the village to talk about their adventures. "You were very brave too," she told the hunter one day. "I couldn't have done it without you." The hunter laughed and said, "We make a great team, don't we?" Years passed, and Little Red Riding Hood grew older, but she never forgot the lesson she learned that day in the forest. She taught other children in the village how to stay safe and always be aware of their surroundings. Her story spread far beyond the village, and many people learned from her experience. Little Red Riding Hood became a symbol of bravery and wisdom, and her tale was told to children all over the land, reminding them to always be cautious. And so, Little Red Riding Hood's story came to a happy end. She continued to visit her grandmother, who lived a long and healthy life. the wolf never returned, and the forest remained peaceful. Little Red Riding Hood's bravery became a legend in the village, and her kindness and wisdom were admired by all. As she grew up, she always remembered the importance of being careful and listening to her parents' advice. And she lived happily ever after.